Kingston, Jamaica, April 1978. Bob Marley had just finished a concert at National Stadium. 20,000 people. Electric energy. But as Bob walked to his car backstage, he heard something that stopped him cold. A voice, small and pure, singing the song he'd just performed. Bob turned around. In the shadows behind the stage, sitting on the ground near the trash bins, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Covered in dirt, wearing torn clothes, singing his song with her eyes closed, like she was in church, like she was praying. Bob walked toward her slowly. His band members were calling him, but he didn't hear them. All he could hear was this little girl's voice. When he got close enough, he could see tears running down her dirty cheeks. She was singing and crying at the same time. Bob felt his own tears start. He'd just performed for 20,000 people. But this little girl with nothing but the clothes on her back was singing his song with more soul than he'd ever heard. When she opened her eyes and saw Bob standing there, she gasped. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to bother you." Bob shook his head, unable to speak. He knelt down in front of her. "Don't apologize," he finally managed to say. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." The girl looked down at her hands, and Bob noticed something strange. Her fingers were moving as if playing an invisible guitar, matching the rhythm perfectly. Someone had taught her music, but who could that be for a street child? "What's your name?" Bob asked gently. "Grace," she whispered. The name stirred something in Bob's memory. His mother had a sister named Grace who disappeared years ago. But that couldn't be related, could it? Grace's eyes flickered toward the darkness beyond the stage. She was watching for someone. Bob felt uneasy despite the warm Caribbean night. "Who taught you that song?" he asked. Grace's expression changed, fear mixed with something else he couldn't read. "My mama," she said quietly. Before she didn't finish. Bob's chest tightened. There was weight to those unspoken words. "Where do you live, Grace?" Bob asked. The girl's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Nowhere. I sleep where I can. Behind the market, sometimes at the church if the pastor lets me." Bob felt anger rising. Not at the girl. At a world that could let a child with such a gift suffer alone in the shadows. Right at that moment, Bob made a decision. He didn't fully understand why it felt so urgent. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. Grace stared at it like it might disappear if she reached for it. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Bob saw something old in her young eyes. A weariness no 6-year-old should carry. "Because you sing like you understand what the songs really mean," Bob said. Grace's hand slowly reached for his, trembling. When their fingers touched, Bob felt something pass between them. Recognition, connection. As Bob led Grace toward his car, his guitarist Tyrone called out, "Bob, man, we need to go. The crowd outside is getting crazy." There was an edge in Tyrone's voice that seemed odd. Bob waved him off. He opened the back door of his Mercedes for Grace. She climbed in carefully, afraid she might dirty the leather seats. "Take us to Hope Road," Bob instructed his driver Marcus. The car pulled away from the stadium into the night streets of Kingston. Shadows seemed longer than usual. As they drove, Grace pressed her face against the window, watching the city lights blur past. Bob studied her profile, trying to understand what felt so familiar about her. Meeting her didn't feel like random chance. It felt like destiny. "Grace," Bob said softly. "Your mother. What was her name?" The girl turned to him. In the passing streetlights, her face seemed to shift between child and something older. "She said I shouldn't tell anyone," Grace whispered. "She said it was dangerous, that people were looking for us, that we had to stay hidden." Bob's stomach dropped. Those were the exact words his own mother had said to him when he was young. When they'd fled from someone or something his mother never fully explained. Who was really behind this? The car hit a pothole. Grace's small bag fell from her lap. Its contents spilled across the seat. A few coins, a piece of stale bread, and something that made Bob's heart stop. A photograph. Old and creased, showing a young woman standing next to a man Bob barely remembered. His father, Norval Marley. Bob picked up the photograph with shaking hands. The image was faded, water-damaged in places, but he could make out his father's face. Grace immediately reached for it, panic flooding her eyes. "That's mine," she said. Real terror was in her voice. "Grace," Bob said carefully. "How did you get this?" The girl's eyes filled with tears. She clutched the photograph to her chest. "Mama gave it to me before she went away," Grace said. She told me if anything happened to her, I should find the man in this picture, that he would help me, that he owed her that much. Bob's mind raced. The man in the photograph was his father, but the woman wasn't his mother. Who was she and what was her connection to Norval Marley? Could it be his father had other relationships? Other children he'd never acknowledged? Inside Bob's house on Hope Road, several of Bob's friends were lounging in the living room. When they saw Bob enter with the dirty little girl, conversation stopped. Bob felt their stares. "Everyone out," Bob said quietly but firmly. They obeyed. Bob was alone with Grace. "Are you hungry?" Bob asked. Grace nodded. Her stomach audibly growled. He prepared rice and beans, the same simple meal his mother had made for him when they had nothing else. As Grace ate, Bob sat across from her, studying her features in better light. There was something about her. The way she held her head, the shape of her hands, things that felt familiar. "My mama used to play guitar," Grace said between bites. "She taught me the chords. Even though we never had a real guitar, we'd pretend with sticks and strings." Bob's throat tightened. That's exactly what he'd done as a child, making instruments from whatever he could find. "What else did your mama tell you about?" Bob asked, trying to sound casual though his heart was pounding. Grace paused, considering how much to reveal. "She said," Grace started, then stopped. Fear crossed her face. Bob reached across the table. "It's okay," he said. "You're safe here." Grace took a deep breath. "Mama said she knew someone special, someone whose music was going to change the world. She said I should listen to those songs, because they had messages in them, hidden messages that only certain people could understand. People like us." Bob felt dizzy. Those words echoed something he'd always felt but never articulated, that his songs carried meanings beyond the surface, coded messages to people who were waiting, searching, fighting for something bigger. "Did she tell you her name?" Bob asked urgently. Grace looked down at her plate, her small body trembling. "I can't," she whispered. "Mama said never to tell anyone her name. She said it was dangerous." Bob felt a deep unease. The girl was protecting her mother's name, keeping it hidden, like it was the last piece of her identity, the last secret. But why was it so dangerous? Who was her mother that even her name needed to be buried? But something strange happened then. Grace's eyes suddenly focused on something behind Bob. Her face went white. Absolute terror. Bob spun around. One of his windows was slightly open, curtains moving in a breeze that felt wrong, too cold. He had the distinct sensation someone had been watching them, listening. Bob rushed to the window. He looked out into his garden, but saw nothing except shadows dancing in moonlight. When he turned back to Grace, she was standing now, pressed against the kitchen wall, her body rigid. "They found us," Grace whispered, her voice hollow with despair. Bob felt ice in his veins. Who were they and what did they want with this child? Right at that moment, Bob heard footsteps on his porch, heavy and deliberate. Someone knocked on his front door. 3 slow, measured knocks. It felt like a threat rather than a request. Bob moved to the door cautiously, his hand on the knob. Grace hissed, "Don't open it!" But Bob had never been one to hide from confrontation. He opened the door. A tall man in a dark suit stood there, his face shadowed by a fedora. The man's eyes were cold, calculating. "Mr. Marley," the man said. His voice was smooth and cold. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Bob's jaw tightened. He positioned himself in the doorway, blocking the man's view. "I don't know what you're talking about," Bob said. The man smiled, but it was a smile without warmth, like a predator. "The girl," the man said simply. "Grace, I believe she calls herself. Though that's not her real name, is it?" Bob felt Grace's presence behind him. He could hear her rapid breathing. He spread his stance, made himself an immovable barrier. "She's under my protection now," Bob said. The words felt right, like he'd been preparing to say them his whole life. But what was he really getting himself into? The man's smile faded. Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Mr. Marley, you're a musician, an artist. Stay in your lane. You don't understand the forces at play here. The people who've invested significant resources in finding this child." Bob's fists clenched. That old trench-town fighting spirit rose in him. "Why do you want her?" Bob demanded. "She's just a child. That's not your concern," the man replied. "What should concern you is your career, your family, your life." All could become very complicated if you're difficult. Before Bob could respond, Grace stepped out from behind him. Her small frame was shaking, but her voice was surprisingly steady. "He's going to kill me," she said flatly, "just like he killed my mama." The man in the suit didn't deny it. That silence was more terrifying than any confirmation. "Get back inside, Grace," Bob said without taking his eyes off the man. To his surprise, she obeyed. The man on the porch sighed. "Mr. Marley, I'm going to give you until tomorrow night to reconsider," he said. "Think about your family, your mother, your wife, your children. Think about how easily things can change, how accidents happen, and then make the smart choice." With that, the man turned and walked down the steps into darkness. Bob watched him go, his body shaking with rage and fear. What had he just brought into his life? Could trying to save one child cost him everything? But could he live with himself if he did nothing? Bob closed and locked the door, then rushed back to the kitchen. Grace was standing by the window, talking in rapid whispers. But there was no one there. Grace was clearly having a conversation with someone, her eyes focused on empty air. "Grace," Bob said gently. The girl turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "She says we need to leave Kingston," Grace said. Bob's confusion deepened. "Who says that?" he asked. Grace looked back at the empty space beside her, then back to Bob. "Mama," Grace said simply. "She's right here. She's been with me since she died. She's the one who told me to find you." Bob felt his skepticism warring with something else. He'd grown up with Rastafarian mysticism, with stories of spirits and ancestors watching over the living. But accepting those stories and confronting them as reality were two different things. Yet what if Grace was telling the truth? "What does she say?" Bob asked. He decided to trust the moment rather than his doubts. Grace closed her eyes, listening to something Bob couldn't hear. When she opened them again, there was determination there. "She says you need to call someone who can help, someone from London who knows about these things, someone you trust." Bob felt his breath catch. Grace couldn't possibly know about Tony Welsh, a friend from his days in London, a man with connections to people who operated outside the law. Bob had never mentioned Tony publicly, so how could Grace or her mother's spirit know about him? Bob walked to his phone, his hand shaking slightly. He dialed the number he'd memorized years ago, used only twice before, both times in desperate situations. Tony answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly from sleep. "It better be good," Tony said. "Tony, it's Bob. I need help," Bob said. There was a long pause. "What kind of help?" Tony finally asked. Bob looked at Grace. She was watching him with those old eyes. "I need to get a child out of Jamaica. Tonight if possible. Somewhere safe where certain people can't find her." Another long pause. "Bob, what have you gotten yourself into?" Tony asked, genuine concern in his voice. "I don't fully know yet," Bob admitted. "But there's a child's life at stake, and I think it might be connected to things from the past, things that people want to stay buried." Tony was quiet for a moment. "I can have someone there by dawn," Tony said. "But Bob, if you're doing this, you need to be prepared. These things spiral. Are you ready for that?" Bob looked at Grace again, at this small girl who'd somehow become the center of a mystery. "I'm ready," Bob said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. "All right, I'll make the calls. Keep the girl hidden until my man arrives. He'll identify himself with a phrase, 'Jah provides for the righteous.' And Bob, be careful." Bob hung up. He turned to find Grace had moved to his piano, her small fingers touching the keys gently. She began to hum a melody Bob had never heard before. Something haunting and beautiful, simple but pure. When Grace stopped, she turned to Bob with tears on her face. "Mama says thank you," she whispered. "She says she knew you'd help when no one else would." Bob felt something tighten in his chest. Those words suggested a connection he barely remembered. But what if it had meant more than he'd known? Right at that moment, Bob heard gravel crunching in his driveway. Multiple vehicles. His heart jumped into his throat. It was too early for Tony's contact, which meant someone else was here. Bob grabbed Grace's hand, pulled her toward the back of the house. "The studio," Bob said, thinking of the small recording booth he'd built behind his house. They ran through the darkness of his garden, Bob's hand tight around Grace's. Bob could hear voices behind them, men calling his name, could see flashlights cutting through the night. They reached the studio. Bob fumbled with his keys, hands shaking. He finally got the door open, pulled Grace inside, locked it behind them. The little room suddenly felt like both a sanctuary and a trap. Bob pulled Grace into the small recording booth, the tiny soundproof room within the room. They crouched in the darkness. Bob could feel Grace trembling beside him. He put his arm around her. "It's going to be okay," Bob whispered. But the words felt hollow. Grace looked up at him. In the dim light coming through the tiny window, Bob saw something in her expression that took his breath away. Faith. Complete and absolute. Bob felt the weight of that trust. He would die before letting anyone hurt this child. They heard footsteps outside the studio, heard someone try the door handle. Bob held his breath. His heart was hammering. Grace pressed closer to him. The men outside were talking, their voices muffled but audible. Bob heard the man from the porch. "Check everywhere. They can't have gone far. The girl has something we need, something her mother stole. We can't let it reach the public." So that was it. Grace wasn't just a witness. She was carrying something, evidence. Bob looked at the girl questioningly. She seemed to understand his unspoken question. She reached into her torn shirt, pulled out a small package wrapped in plastic, no bigger than a deck of cards. She pressed it into Bob's hands. "Mama said to give this to you if the bad men came," Grace whispered. "She said you'd know what to do with it, that you'd make sure people saw it." Sarah, that was her name. Sarah. She said you'd use your voice to tell the truth. Bob held the package. Then the name hit him like a wave. Sarah. He'd known a Sarah, years ago in Trenchtown, when he was just starting to make music. A woman who disappeared without explanation. Could this be the same Sarah? Was Grace connected to her? His life had just changed forever. The footsteps outside moved away. Bob heard cars starting, engines fading into the distance. He waited in the darkness, counting minutes. Finally, when he was as certain as he could be, he led Grace out of the studio, back to the main house. They sat in his living room. Dawn was beginning to break through the windows. Bob looked at the package in his hands. Should he open it now? Grace seemed to read his thoughts. "Mama says you should look at it," she said quietly. "So you understand why it matters." Bob nodded, his hands trembling. He carefully unwrapped the plastic. Inside were photographs. Not many, maybe a dozen. But what they showed made his stomach turn. People in hospital beds, IVs attached to their arms, their eyes vacant, empty. Like something had been taken from them. Documents with official government seals. But the text was partially obscured. Words like medical trials and indigent populations visible. But the details hidden, burned or torn away. Financial records showing money flowing between organizations. But the names blacked out. The amounts unclear. And at the center of it all, a network that seemed to connect powerful people. Politicians maybe. Business leaders. Using Jamaica's poorest citizens for something terrible. But what exactly? The evidence suggested crimes. Corruption. Maybe experiments. But nothing was conclusive. Nothing was complete. It was like having pieces of a puzzle but not enough to see the whole picture. This wasn't proof that would stand up in court. This was just enough to ask questions. To start investigations. to make people uncomfortable. But it was also enough to get people killed. "Your mama," Bob said slowly. "What did she tell you about this? About what your grandfather discovered?" Grace's face went pale. She looked at that empty space beside her again. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Grandpa worked for the government," Grace said, "doing things that were supposed to help Jamaica. But something went wrong. Mama said he realized they were using people, treating them like they weren't human. And when he tried to stop it, they killed him. And then they came after Mama. And then after me." Bob felt cold spreading through his body. What Grace was describing sounded like the kind of operations people whispered about but never confirmed. If it was true, if Grace and her mother had evidence of such things, then yes. Powerful people would want them silenced. But was it true? Or was it trauma? A child's misunderstanding? There was no way to know for sure. And that uncertainty made it even more terrifying. As the sun fully rose, Bob heard a knock at the door. Gentle this time, almost respectful. A voice called out, "Jah provides for the righteous." Bob felt relief flood through him. This was Tony's contact. He opened the door. A young man stood there. Couldn't have been more than 25, but his eyes were old. "Tony sent me," the young man said. "We need to move quickly." "She's here," Bob said. "But there's something else now. Something important." He showed the young man the photographs. The man's expression changed, from professional calm to something else. "This is bigger than we thought," the man said quietly. "This isn't just about protecting one child anymore." He looked at Bob carefully. "How much do you know?" "Not enough," Bob admitted. "But enough to know people have died for this." The young man nodded. "Tony needs to see this. We need to figure out what we're really dealing with. And we need to get you both somewhere safe." Bob looked back at Grace. She'd fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted. She looked so small, so vulnerable. "I'm coming with you," Bob said. "Wherever you're taking her. I'm not letting her out of my sight." The young man studied Bob for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but you need to understand. Once we leave here, you can't come back."
"Not for a while."
"Maybe not ever. Your family, your home, your life here. You're walking away from all of it. Are you sure?" Bob thought about his wife Rita, his children, his mother, the people who depended on him, the music he still needed to make. But he also thought about Grace, about a child who'd come into his life singing his songs, who'd connected with something deep in his soul, who trusted him with complete faith. The timing was right. The connection to Sarah made sense, but there were gaps, questions, things that didn't quite add up. Maybe he'd never know for sure. Maybe that was part of the mystery he'd have to live with. "I'm sure," Bob said. "Then we need to go now." Bob went to wake Grace gently. When her eyes opened and she saw him, she smiled. A real, genuine smile. "Are we going somewhere safe?" she asked. Bob nodded. He brushed hair from her face. "Yes," Bob said. "Somewhere safe. And then we're going to figure out what to do about what your mama gave us. We're going to make sure her death wasn't for nothing. We're going to tell people what happened, using the only weapons that really matter. Music and truth." Grace's smile widened. She took his hand. As they walked to the car, Bob looked back at his house, at Hope Road, at the life he was leaving behind. He wondered what would come next, what sacrifices would be required, what dangers awaited. But he also felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Absolute certainty that he was doing the right thing, that everything in his life had been leading to this moment, to this child, to this fight. In the back seat of the car as they drove away from Hope Road into the uncertain dawn, Grace began to hum softly. That same melody from before, simple but haunting. Bob found himself humming along, their voices blending together in harmony. And as they drove through Kingston's waking streets, Bob thought about the mystery he was now part of, the questions that might never be fully answered. Who was Sarah really? Was Grace his daughter or just connected to his past in some other way? What did the photographs really prove? What was the full truth about the conspiracy? Would they ever know? Or would these questions follow them forever? Part of him wanted answers, wanted certainty, wanted to understand every piece of the puzzle. But another part of Bob understood that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. That life was full of ambiguities and uncertainties. That faith sometimes meant moving forward without knowing the whole truth. Maybe that was okay. Maybe that was how it was supposed to be. Bob looked at Grace beside him. She'd fallen asleep again, her head resting against his shoulder, trusting him completely, and Bob made a silent promise. He didn't know if she was his daughter, didn't know if the evidence they carried would change anything, didn't know what forces they were really up against. But he knew he'd protect this child with everything he had. He'd use his voice to tell her story, to shine light into darkness, to fight for justice even when justice seemed impossible, because that's what his music had always been about. And as the sun climbed higher in the Jamaican sky, Bob Marley held Grace close and prepared for whatever came next, knowing that some things were worth fighting for even if the fight cost everything, knowing that some mysteries were worth protecting, even if they were never fully understood, and knowing that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply show up for someone who needed you, to refuse to walk away no matter what darkness tried to pull you apart. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. More stories about Bob Marley will be uploaded to the channel soon. You can help the video reach more people by leaving a comment.